Hey everybody, it's James Rowe. We're here for lesson 5 of our Novak After Effects series. Today we're going to be going over motion tracking basics, and we're also going to be going over some keying basics as well. I can tell you right now that there is a ton of different motion tracking methods that you could use in After Effects, and we just don't have time to cover all of them, but I will show you the ones that work consistently well. And if you're really into that and you want to explore more, definitely highly encourage you to do some more tutorials online with it and things like that. So let's go ahead and dive into our project here. Go ahead and open up your AE05 delivery folder and find the project that I gave you guys. And you'll see here that today, since I'm hoping you guys are pretty familiar at this point with importing things and organizing your project, I already organized your project a little bit for you, and I've already got the compositions laid out. You can see we have a bunch of compositions that we're going to be working on today, and we're going to start right now with L5A. So go ahead and double click on that and open it up, and then just go ahead and press play and let that RAM preview out for a moment there. And you'll see that this is actually some footage from Adobe. It's in their official training material, and it's of this guy walking along here. Looks like kind of a nomadic hunter. He's got his bow and arrow, and someone was walking behind them with the camera, and you can see that it's a handheld shot and it's pretty shaky. So we can use motion tracking technology in After Effects to actually smooth this shot out significantly. So what is motion tracking? Well, essentially, it's tracking the movement of either a camera in a particular shot, or it's tracking the movement of a person or an object in the shot. So it's pretty much tracking anything you want to track. In this case, we're actually going to track the movement of the camera through a very special tool, and that's going to help us smooth out this handheld shot here. So let's go ahead and click on the Paladin handheld layer there, and we're going to need to open up a very special tool. So you're going to want to go to Window, Tracker right here, and that's going to open up the Tracker panel. And this is where you can get a lot of motion tracking work done. Not all of it, but a significant amount of it. You can see there's all sorts of different ones here. We're actually going to go over a number of these today. But the first one that I wanted to go over was this warp stabilizer right here. Warp stabilizer. And with your Paladin handheld layer clicked and selected, go ahead and choose that warp stabilizer button in your tracker panel. And you'll see a blue ribbon go across your screen, and it's going to say, in your effects panel, you'll see that it's applied as an effect. And then it gives you kind of a status right here, percentage done. Now I can tell you right now that this shot is very small and it's very low resolution, and because of that, this tracker just blitzed through it really quickly. That being said, just like everything in After Effects, the higher the resolution, the higher the amount of color information in your shot, all those different things, the slower this is going to go. Additionally, the longer your shot is, the slower this is going to go. So this does not always work so ideally. So let me tell you exactly what happened right there. Before I explain it, let's just go ahead and play this new version. So I've got my warp stabilizer applied. I really just selected the clip and hit that button right there, and boom, we're done. Let's play it and RAM preview it now. Look at that. That is pretty darn awesome looking. Suddenly we went from this really handheld shaky shot that looked pretty amateurish to this really beautiful Steadicam shot. Immediately raised the production value of this shot, by several $1,000s, right? And what's happening there is when I clicked on that warp stabilizer button, After Effects throws out a number of what are called tracking points. This is a cloud tracker. So it throws out these tracking points all over the image there, and the tracking points latch on to one pixel in the image on frame 1. So let me see if I can pull those up right now. Show track points right here. This is under the advanced setting in the effect. So if I click on show track points, those are the track points that I'm talking about. And it's called a cloud tracker because it makes this big cloud of track points in the shot. And it kind of throws them out there randomly, arbitrarily, right? So it throws these track points out on frame 1. And then once these little crosses, these little X's, land on a pixel on frame 1, they latch on to that one pixel. And their one job through the rest of the shot is to track that pixel's motion through the entire shot, all the way to the very end. So this pink cross right here, its one job is to follow whatever is in the middle of that, which is that little black area right there. It's trying to attach and track to that one black area, and it doesn't want to leave that. It just want to track it all the way through. And if I play forward here, you'll actually see that it is doing a really good job. It's following that little black spot on the bricks all the way through. Now once I get over and it starts to blur out, the track point disappears. As soon as it stops understanding where it is, it just randomly disappears, and another one gets thrown out there to replace it. So that's what's happening here. These track points are all tracking all of these different objects in the shot, not just the wall, but it's also, a few of them are tracking right here on the individual. A lot of them are tracking over here on the trees, and obviously down here on the ground as well, on these big stones. And so all of these trackers are moving across the entire shot, tracking all these individual pixels. And what happens is all of these little track points get together at the very end of this tracking process, and After Effects collects all the data points, finds out how every pixel that was tracked is moving in the shot, and then it comes up with a really pretty miraculously accurate idea of what the camera is doing just by focusing on the movement of these few individual pixels in the frame. Once it figures out the motion of the camera, and it determines, okay, the camera is kind of shaky right here. Very obviously, there's a big camera shake right there. And then it kind of smooths out, and so on and so forth. Once it figures out the motion of that camera, it can reverse it. It literally takes the movement of the camera, and it keyframes the image automatically for you. If I open the image up down here, you'll see there's not a single keyframe, right? It's all kind of happening in the background. But it keyframes the position of the image, and it also warps the image over time so that the image remains relatively smooth and the camera movement looks smoother as a result. Pretty awesome technology. And you can see here, you can go out there and shoot a scene without a Steadicam under ideal conditions, and you get some pretty darn amazing shots. So let's go ahead and play that footage one more time there, just to show you guys. Oh, I need to hide my tracking points because that turns off the stabilization. Let's go ahead and just watch the shot once more without stabilization applied. Ooh, that's gross looking. Now, stabilization is applied. Those track points have created the camera movement log, and then that camera movement has kind of been reversed and applied back to the image. And now we get this beautiful Steadicam shot. Now, let me tell you something. This is an ideal situation, okay? It's not always going to work this beautifully. In fact, I would say the chances of the warp stabilizer working this beautifully every single time, 50-50, maybe 60-40, something like that. Adobe just hands out this shot because they can say, hey, look how beautiful our tracking software is, and look how good our warp stabilizer is. It doesn't always work that great. And one of the reasons that is kind of a dead giveaway is right angles and hard angular objects in the frame. So if you've got a bunch of right angles, you'll really see where this warp stabilizer starts to fail. So this shot looks pretty darn good. Let's look at a shot that just the warp stabilizer is not going to be able to work out. So go on back to your project panel. I'm going to click on my little arrows over here to take up, go back from the effects controls all the way back to project. And go ahead and find this L5C, L5 Charlie, and open that up. And go ahead and RAM preview this shot out. Look at that. Cool building, but man, that camera work is rough. Look at that camera work. It's obviously shot on a really small camera, probably a digital SLR, and so you're getting a lot of vibration from the camera operator's hand. And then you're also just getting a generally kind of rough tilt up there on this building. So the instinct of the editor or the After Effects artist is going to be like, well, if we're going to keep this shot and make it usable in some way, we've got to make this camera move a little bit more stable, a little bit more smooth. So the first thing you want to do is click on the clip over here in your timeline. Go back to your tracker panel. If you accidentally close that out, again, it's just under Window, Tracker. And then click on that Warp Stabilizer button with the footage selected. Go ahead and let that stabilize. All right, it successfully stabilized it. We've got a 100% done over here. Let's look right now at what our results. Whoa, you guys see that? Okay. So the warp stabilizer is doing what it's supposed to do. It's trying to warp this image so that the motion is smooth. And if you look at the movement of the camera itself, man, it actually is a pretty smooth camera move now. But what's happened as a result of this stabilization is that it's warped these right angles on the building, angles that we're all very familiar and acutely aware of, these 90-degree angles. And when those things start to warp and change shape and skew, I mean, that's just going to pop out to us immediately. And so here we have this shot. It's still unusable. The warp stabilizer is just not going to work that well on it. So whenever you've got something like this where the warp stabilizer isn't necessarily working, we can try and change a couple things with our options over here to see if we get a better result. So this is warping the image pretty significantly to try and smooth it. So what if we turned warping off and we just did a position stabilization instead? So if you come over here to your warp stabilizer effect and you look at method, right now subspace warp is selected, and that is what is creating these crazy warped lines. So instead of a subspace warp, what we could do is maybe do a position or a scale. And essentially, when I select position here, what it's doing is it's keyframing the transform properties. It's keyframing that position parameter right there to try and compensate for the movement of the camera. Now again, you don't see those keyframes. It's all hidden within the effect itself, but those keyframes are there. And what's happened now is it's just moved the image around automatically for us. And let's see if we get a better result. Okay. So it's still kind of choppy, but you know what? It's not absolutely terrible anymore. But would I use this shot in an edit? No. It's still choppy up here. You can kind of see, the edge of the building kind of jittering a little bit. So if you don't want to try and, if you're having warping problems with the warp stabilizer, turn that off. Use position. Or try this one, position, scale, and rotation. So now it's keyframing all three of those transform properties to try and smooth out that camera move. Let's look again. See if this one worked any better. Nope, I'd say that one is second to worst. So 2 points there. Don't be afraid to change the method that you see right here between position and perspective and subsurface warp and all that stuff. Don't be afraid to experiment with those. The other point, and probably the most important one here that you can walk away from with this composition, is that sometimes the warp stabilizer just ain't gonna do it. Sometimes your footage is so bad that it's just not gonna work out. Other times, like I had someone approach me at one point to stabilize a couple of shots, and the person, it was a shot of a woman, and she was in a white room, and so the background was entirely white. There was no detail back there at all, just a big white wall. And when I tried to stabilize it using this method and using other methods, well, there's nothing for those cloud points, right? Those tracking points to grab onto in the background. You know, the wall is white, so there's nothing for it to distinguish itself from any other pixels. Therefore, the tracking points just won't resolve. It just won't work out. So there are plenty of times when the warp stabilizer is going to totally fail you. Definitely not something you should ever rely on, though I have known a couple people who have done some kind of Steadicam moves on purpose on set with the intention of using the warp stabilizer, and the effect actually turned out pretty good. Would I do that? No, I wouldn't take the risk, but certainly something to think about. All right, one more really good use of the warp stabilizer is to take a handheld shot and turn it completely stationary. So let's go back to our project panel. I want you guys to open up L5B now. All right, so here's L5B, and I'll go ahead and play this. And you can see here that the camera operator is trying to get some kind of locked off shot. This is obviously some news footage. Got some firefighters down here on the street, and the camera operator is trying to stay still, but they're probably out there without a tripod, being news camera people, and the shot is just not stable enough. So we could use our warp stabilizer. I'm going to go ahead and click on that shot, go over here to my tracker panel, and click on my warp stabilizer. And this time in the effects, I want you guys to pay attention right here to the result category. So right now it says smooth motion, and that's what we've kept it on both times. But let's click on that and go to no motion instead. So what we're telling After Effects is that instead of trying to smooth out the camera move, we want After Effects to try and use its warp capabilities here to try and eradicate the camera move altogether and to make this shot a completely stationary shot. Let's see if it works out. So I'm going to come over here. I've got no motion selected. And this is something you can actually change after it's tracked. So I've got my 202 frames tracked. If I wanted to do smooth motion, all it does is it just takes a second to update itself and it changes the parameters. So you don't have to reset everything when you choose between smooth or no motion. Got that set back to no motion. Let me go ahead and RAM preview that out. Look at that. That's a pretty darn stable shot. You get a little bit of warping, a little bit of movement right here, like I'm looking at this, you know, metal pole right here. And obviously that's not supposed to be moving. Same with these handrails. But After Effects has done a pretty darn good job of making that shot stationary. I mean, really good job. And a lot of this, you know, is up to you as the After Effects artist. You know, when you're looking at a composition, I'm looking at this composition and the composition's not great. But I can see right now that there's a lot of negative space over here. This green pole and this bus stop right here, not a lot of stuff for the audience to look at. And it just so happens that the majority of the movement in the frame that looks unnatural is composed within that area of the frame that no one is probably going to be looking at. So what I would do is, you know, if you haven't done this already, a good thing to do is study the art of composition. Study how the eye is manipulated and drawn in the frame to different areas of the frame. And that's going to inform a lot of your decisions in terms of, you know, is this an acceptable shot anymore? Or is, you know, do I need to, or is it okay? So when I'm looking at this, I can see a lot of this foreground action is moving around, but the real focus of the shot is dead center of the frame. We've got some movement here with the firefighters and some vectors that are pointing us toward this fire truck. And that's where the eye of the audience is probably going to be drawn. And I don't see any strange movement over there whatsoever. So you can kind of make a judgment right now. Do I keep this shot with kind of the strange movement in the area of the frame that no one's going to see? Or do I try and fix it in some other way? Or do I scrap the shot altogether? All of those things are kind of up to you as the artist and as an editor. In my mind, I would probably use this shot. I think it's more than fine. And the weird things that are going on in the shot as a result of the warping, no one's ever going to see. Let's get into a different type of motion tracking, which is much more involved. Up until this point, we've, through these last 3 compositions, we've more or less told After Effects to do it, and it's done it for us. Now we have to get into doing it for ourselves and with After Effects' help. So go ahead and open up L5D. And as I promised you guys at the very beginning of the class, here is that very famous shot from Game of Thrones. And the question is, why did they leave the coffee cup in? Well, here we are. We're going to get rid of that coffee cup. You guys are going to see how incredibly easy it is to get rid of. And then that will deepen the mystery as to why they kept it in the first place. Forgive all these watermarks and stuff. This is all stuff that I just downloaded off of YouTube. But you can see right there very clearly, we've got our Starbucks coffee cup over there sitting on the table. And the other thing that I'm looking at is the movement of the camera, and I can see here that there is a slight handheld move here. Someone's got the camera on their shoulder and they're shooting the scene from, without a tripod. So the first thing I have to do is try and figure out how to track this motion. I can't just erase this cup, on one frame and then have it remain exactly where it's supposed to be because of the movement of the camera. Now, if this particular scene was shot on sticks and the camera never moved, I would only have to erase the cup once, and then I could duplicate that maneuver across all of the other frames and it would be no problem whatsoever. But because this is a handheld move, this is a little bit trickier, and we're going to have to employ a little bit of motion tracking. So let's go ahead and get on with that. So if you zoom in with your scroll wheel into the scene there, I'm going to start by tracking the movement of this cup. To get rid of the cup, I have to know how the cup moves, and then I could cover up the cup with the same exact moves as the cup itself. So I have to track this motion in some way. And to do that, I'm going to make sure that my layer is selected here. And over in my tracker panel, I'm not going to do warp stabilizer anymore. That's not going to help us here in this new land. We're going to actually do track motion. Track motion. So go ahead and click on that button right there. And a couple of things are going to happen that you're going to see. First off, this layer is opened up in its source layer, okay, in the layer view. We're no longer looking at the composition. We've opened it up in the source monitor, and we're looking at it more or less as an individual layer. The next thing you're going to see is our track point here, which is kind of a curious object. So this is the tracker point. You've got a crosshair right in the middle. This is called the area of interest, which is that center square. And this outer square is called the search region. And we need all 3 of these to effectively track any point in the image. So with my tracker here, I'm going to pretend that this track point, okay, is one of those cloud tracker track points from the warp stabilizer. And what those things want is a very, very small object in the frame, or point in the frame, that is high contrast. Very small, well-defined, and high contrast. And that's going to be able to, that's going to allow us to, you know, target it and then track it effectively across time here. So I'm looking at my coffee cup, which I know I have to track, and there's all sorts of really big gradients on this coffee cup, right? Like, so right over here, we've got this kind of gradient area where it's kind of going from shadow to light. The lid is the same exact thing. You know, there's just nothing much going on right there that's well defined. It's just kind of gray and murky. So if I were to throw a tracker point up on there and it was to try and track maybe the edge of the cup or the top of the cup across time, well, look how many pixels in the cup are the exact same color, right? So once I start tracking this cup, it's going to be like, oh, I could track over here or track over here. All of this is fair game, and it's going to kind of lose an accurate track. What you need is just a tiny group of pixels that's very well defined so that the tracker can maintain kind of a surgical grip on it. So when I'm looking at this cup, I don't see anything like that. But I do see right next to the cup a handy dandy tracking point right here. Look at that. Okay? I don't even know what that is. Some kind of reflection of some kind. Maybe there's something wet on the table, or, I mean, gosh, I don't even know. I couldn't even tell you. But that little point right there is small. It's well defined. It's a kind of bright brown or tan object, and it's surrounded by dark tan, dark brown from the table and these shadows over here. So it's kind of seated and well contrast amongst its surroundings. And it's also small, all right? It's not big and broad like the top of this cup. It's really small and well defined. So that is a perfect thing to track right there. So I'm going to actually move my target, my track point, onto that little itty bitty ball. And the first thing I need to do before I do that is make sure that my playhead is on frame 0, which right now mine is not. So I almost messed up there. So I'm going to actually go ahead and move my playhead all the way to the very beginning of my scene. And you can see when I move it up here in my layer window, that it's also moving down there on the composition, even though I'm not viewing the composition right now. And so I've got now my playhead on frame 0. I can still see my tracker, my tracking point right there, well defined. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this track target and I'm going to move it down there to that little circle. So when you move the target, you know, it's easy to mess this up. It's easy to mess up your target. Don't grab the bullseye, okay? Because that's can actually just move the bullseye within this itty bitty square there within the area of interest. Don't grab the edges of any of these boxes because that's going to scale them up. The only thing you need to grab is kind of right here in the dead center. All right, so we've got our bullseye, and then we've got our area of interest. Click in the area of interest itself, but not on any of those white lines. So I'm just going to click right there in that empty area of the area of interest. I'm just going to left click and drag, and it's going to move the target over the frame. And I'm zoomed in quite a lot here, and I'm using my hand tool and my zoom function on the scroll wheel of my mouse. So this is really easy work. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep dragging it down. And as I drag it over the cup, you'll kind of see what's happening in this really dark scene. Is that it's kind of zooming in while I'm dragging it, right? And that X is the target. So I'm going to keep on moving this thing over and over and over until I land on my little trustworthy circle here. And I should say, as I do this, that I have not done this yet. I'm doing this with you guys first. So we're doing it together for the first time. So now that I've got my tracking point dead on that target, right? Dead on that little itty bitty dot down there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust these boxes. So the area of interest is effectively, you want to encapsulate the one thing that you're really interested in, right? So I'm going to grab the edge of my area of interest right here on the corners there, those little handles, and I'm going to drag it down. I'm just going to scale it down a little bit so that it kind of encircles that little, area, a little bright white dot right there. Encircles that, and there's not much else around it that I've encircled. So a lot of the dark brown table and stuff, I'm just going to make sure that those are outside of the boundaries of that box. It's not, you don't have to be super surgical with it, right? Like you don't have to get down here like that. In fact, that's probably not a good idea. But just generally, you want to make sure the size of that circle or the size of this square is more or less framing that little track point. So the bullseye's on the track point, and my area of interest is surrounding the track point. That's giving After Effects a really good idea of exactly what it is we're looking for, or we're looking at, and that we want it to track. And then the next thing is this search area. And this search area is essentially the area, the boundary in which it's going to look for this little dot every single frame. So if your search area, if this is a wildly handheld shot, and maybe in the next frame the dot's going to be way over here or something, well, we need to dramatically increase the search area so that when it jumps over here over the next frame, it'll look within the search area to find it, so it would have to scale up that search area quite a lot. Fortunately for us, though, this is a very subdued handheld shot. There's not a lot of movement. So I don't really need to change my search area size that much, but I am going to go ahead and change it just a little bit and broaden it out, just in case from frame to frame, this circle kind of starts jumping outside of the boundaries of the search area or something like that. All right, so the search area is where After Effects is going to look for that dot every frame. The area of interest frames the track point, and the target is exactly the center of the track point. Now that we've set all of those parameters, with my track point selected, you'll notice that down here, the tracker box has kind of come alive. And there's all sorts of new controls and everything around it. And that's because we've got this track point active. Warp Stabilizer, click on it, everything's automated, there's nothing I need to change, so all these things are gray. But right now, the track point right here is what we're looking at. So with all of that done, and with my playhead on frame 0 and my track point set, I'm going to go ahead and press Analyze Forward down here. Now there's two ways of doing this. Normally, I try and just hit that Analyze Forward button and cross my fingers. The other way to do it is to analyze one frame forward at a time. This is a much slower process, but it can be more accurate if needed. So I'm going to go ahead and press play here. And it plays all the way through. It'll play through the entire clip. And if I zoom in, look at that. That is the movement that was tracked. So that's the movement of that white dot. And because that white dot is sitting right next to that coffee cup, that is effectively the movement of that coffee cup in the frame. And if I kind of move my playhead forward, you can see all of those individual dots are, in fact, keyframes. If I go down here to my transform controls and I look, I'll see a motion tracker category. And under tracker 1, it's established a bunch of keyframes for every single frame of the track. So that is a history of that cup's motion in the frame. That's what you're seeing right there. Every single frame has been recorded, and the motion of that cup is now effectively recorded. So now that we've recorded the motion of that cup and we have it kind of saved, the next thing I need to do is I need to go back into my composition and replace that coffee cup on frame 1. So I'm going to go back to composition L5D, and again, don't get tripped up by this. Right now you're looking at the layer view, so you need to go back over here to the composition tab in your composition window. That's going to open up that shot again. And what I did was I actually gave you guys a leg up. So if you look inside of your stills folder, what you're going to find is a Game of Thrones cup fixed TIFF file, a still image there. And you can see right here that I very quickly erased the cup from the shot, and I did that using Photoshop. Now you might be like, hey, come on, can't we do this in Photoshop together? Well, we will. We'll do this or something very similar to this next lesson, which is entirely centered around Photoshop and After Effects and their integration with one another. But for now, it's enough to just know that I took the one frame of this individual video and I brought it into Photoshop, and I used some of the Photoshop tools to completely erase the cup. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag that Game of Thrones cup fixed TIFF file, and I'm just going to drag it and drop it on top of my regular Game of Thrones footage there in sequence L5D. And if I have it on top, you'll see, oh man, yeah, that looks great, right? We fixed it. No, well, obviously we didn't. It's just a still image, and when we drop it on the composition, now everything is still, so that is a problem. I'm going to create a mask right now, and I'm going to get rid of everything except for that area around the cup itself. So with my playhead parked on frame 0 there, I'm actually going to go ahead and go over to my pin tool right there. Go ahead and activate that. And we need to draw a mask around. We just need to cut out all of this image except for that area where the cup is. And we need to be very careful because her hands are in the cup, or are very near the cup, and we don't want to mess that up. So the first thing I'm going to do before I start drawing that mask is I'm going to go over here and open the transform properties of the image, and I'm going to just temporarily drop the opacity so I can start to see the cup in there, just ever so slightly, right? The whole idea being that we can now kind of see behind that still image, see exactly where the cup is, so that we can create a very accurate mask as we draw this. So now I'm going to, with my Game of Thrones cup fixed TIFF image selected, I'm just going to, in my pen tool active, I'm just going to draw a very tight mask around this cup. Something like this, and I'm giving it a little bit of fat on the sides where I can. Something like that. Now I'll change the opacity of my layer back to 100. And there, the cup is gone. Now we've got some problems that we need to fix. Alright, this looks pretty rough. We've got like just this snippet of table, and that table is, obviously not lined up and stuff like that. And it's also not feathered. So under my mask properties, in my layer, or in my timeline, I'm going to go down and open up the mask settings like we did last class. And under mask feather, I'm just going to feather that out some. I'm going to adjust the feather of the mask as much as I can before I start seeing the actual cup show up. Something like that. Oh man, is that the top of the cup I'm seeing? Yes, it is. So I can't feather it that much. Maybe I'll adjust my expansion so that the feathering is kind of going beyond the edges of the mask that I made. Alright, so that's looking pretty decent. Take a couple minutes there and find the amount of feathering and the amount of mask expansion that works for you. And then once you've found that, the next thing you want to do is align this table up, right? If I click off my mask, you can see that the table is not aligned. It's kind of very roughly aligned there. So I need to move this layer, and I'm going to do that just by clicking on it right here in the image, in the composition window, and moving it around. One thing to be aware of when you do this and you have a mask applied is you don't want to mess up the mask by moving the mask on accident. So when you're moving a layer that's already been masked out, you're always going to want to click inside of the layer. Don't click on the edges of the mask. Otherwise, you'll start to manipulate the shape of the mask and not the position of the layer. So I'm just going to move that over, and I'm going to try and line up the table to the best of my ability right there. Something like that, maybe. And again, remember that you can turn off those mask lines so you get a little bit of view of what's going on back there. And that's looking pretty good. And now the last thing that I'm going to do before I apply my motion tracking data to it is I need to move the anchor point of this layer. So we haven't talked about anchor points much since kind of our earliest lessons. But the anchor point for this layer is way up here. And that's because this layer is the entire size of the frame, right? And the anchor point is normally the geometric center of the layer itself. And when you do a transform, like a move or a rotation or whatever, it's going off of the geometric center of the layer. So right now, if I were to rotate this layer around, and I don't want you to do this, but check that out. As I rotate it around, it's rotating around that anchor point. Even though we've cut so much out of the layer that, you know, none of this is actually effective. Though what we need to do is we need to change the geometric center of from what it once was to its new shape way down here. And to do that, I'm going to use what's called the pan behind tool. And that's way up here in your tool palette. It's this little button right here. It looks like 4 compass arrows. So if I click on that, and then I click on my anchor point right here, left click and hold, I can actually drag and move my anchor point around and reposition it. And what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and find a rough geometric center to this shape here. And I'm going to drag and drop my anchor point using that pan behind tool right into the geometric center of the new shape that I've cut out with that mask. So now if I rotate it, right, it's rotating within itself. So I've reestablished the geometric center to something that makes more sense for its new shape. And that's really important because when we apply the tracking data from the cup to this shape, it's going to be applying it in relation to the geometric center. So by reestablishing the geometric center to something that makes sense for the shape, it's going to work a lot better for us. Okay, so now we've got this mask on. Let's just go ahead and play it and you'll see the problem. There you go. Problem's pretty easily seen there. It's a handheld shot. We've got a still image that's not moving in any way. And because the frame is moving around, the image is just staying stationary, and it's very easy to see that our secrets. So what I'm going to do now is go back to frame 0. It's always important to remain on frame 0 when you can, when you're doing this tracking stuff, because if you don't start tracking and apply tracking information with your frame on with your playhead on frame 0, it could really mess everything up. So keep everything rewound all the way to the beginning of the scene as you do this work. So now I need to go back to my cup footage, and I need to pull that transform data, that tracking data that I pulled, and I need to place it onto the Game of Thrones cup. A fixed image, which is right here. So I'm going to go ahead and click back on my Game of Thrones.mp4, the video clip itself, and to open up it up in the layer view, which is what I need to do to open up the tracker. All I got to do is double click on it right here. You can also, of course, just go back to your layer tab up here in the composition window, and you'll see that the tracker point is there. So always remember that within a composition, you're never going to see a tracker for any given layer. You have to open it up in the layer view to actually see its tracker. So there's my track point. Got my playhead on frame 0 with my track point selected. And I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that I've got it selected by clicking on it here in my timeline. The next thing I need to do is choose a target for this tracker. So I'm going to go ahead and change my target. I'm going to click on Edit Target right here. And it wants to know now, where do you want to transfer this tracked motion to? What layer? So if I click on this, I'm going to see a list of layers that are inside of the composition. And we only have 2 right now. We've got the layer that I tracked the movement from, and we've got Game of Thrones cup fixed.tiff. So I'm going to click on that, make sure that's selected, press OK. And then I have the option to change the position, rotation, and scale of this particular track. But since we only used one track point for this, we're only going to want to use position. So I'm going to go ahead with my target selected. I'm going to go ahead and click on Apply. And it's going to say Apply Dimensions, X and Y, or you can choose X only or Y only. Now this is a complicated handheld maneuver, so I'm going to click on X and Y. The cup is moving on the X axis and the Y axis in the shot. Normally you want to keep that on X and Y. Very rarely do you want to just do X only, horizontal plane only, or Y only. X and Y is selected there, and I press OK. And now it's going to throw us back onto the composition. Now I can play this composition, and I can see very clearly, number one, the movement, the placement of this mask has moved a little bit, and I need to readjust that position. That's not a big deal though. That's something we can fix. The most important thing that I can see here is that the track is really good. And the coffee cup itself and that layer, the fixed layer that we added to it, it is moving directly in line with the movement of the camera and the movement of the cup. There's no jittering or anything like that going on. So that's great news. So the next thing I'm going to do is I need to tweak the position of this particular layer again. Now this is very tricky. This is where it gets a little tricky and something that can really mess you up. So if I open up my Game of Thrones fixed TIFF there, I want you to see what happened. Check it out. When I applied the tracking motion from the cup to this layer, After Effects keyframed the position of this particular layer across the entire image. So it took the movement of the cup and it copied the movement directly to the position parameter right here. And that is what's happening. That's why that layer is now moving alongside the cup in perfect unison. Well, if I come over here and I adjust the position of this to like reframe it, look what happens. Okay? Check it out, watch. Boop! Okay, and that's because every single frame has already been keyframed for its position. So I could no longer use the position parameter here to remove this. And this is a common thing that's going to happen. You can help yourself in a big way. You know, you can get rid of some of this effect by just using that pan behind tool and trying to reset the anchor point as best you can. That's going to help a lot. But most of the time, some repositioning of the layer after the tracking information has been applied, that's pretty normal. So after we've got all of that applied, how do I change this position without altering my keyframes? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to parent this to a new layer. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to go to Layer, New, Null Object. Null Object. And that's going to create what's called a null. And this is a null. Let me solo that null for you so you could see it. It's nothing. It's literally nothing. There's no color. There's no information inside of it. It's literally an empty layer. But it has control points on it so that I can kind of move it around and all that stuff. And if I open it up, it's got transform properties. But there's literally nothing in it. So it's just like an extra set of handles that I could use to control something else. So that's what a null is. And I'm going to rename this null So I'm going to right click on it and go to rename. And I'm just going to call this cup position control. And from now on, if I want to tweak the position of this cup, I'm going to use this null object instead of the Game of Thrones fixed layer. So how do we link these two together? How do I take control away from the cup fixed layer and apply it to my cup position control null? We do what's called parenting, which is kind of the funnest thing to do down here on the timeline. There's a little squiggly, or at least there should be, in your timeline, and that's called the pick whip. The pick whip right there, little squiggly. If you don't for some reason see that, what you're going to do is right click up here on these columns, anywhere on them. If you right click and go to columns, you should see something that says parent and link. Make sure there's a checkbox in there. And then you should see these little squigglies somewhere along there. So whenever you parent a layer to another layer, what's happening is you're kind of joining them together in unison, which is to say, if I move one or change the rotation of one, it's going to move and change the rotation of the other. So I'm going to say that this null object that I created is going to be the parent, and anything that the parent does, the child will also do, or the children, depending on how many layers you end up linking in this way. And this Game of Thrones cup is going to be the child. So to parent in this way, what you're going to do is use this pick whip here. And if you left click and hold on this pick whip button, like so, you get a little line. That little blue line, you can kind of stretch it out as long as you want, kind of rotate it around. And the pick whip button that I'm going to pick, that I'm using here, is the one on the cup layer, okay? Not on the null layer, it's the cup layer itself. You start on the child layer. So I left click on that parent link pick whip, hold, drag outwards, and I'm going to drag a line, and I'm going to point my line directly onto the parent layer. So I'm just left clicking and holding, and I'm dragging that line up to cup position control. And you can see right now that that's now listed. When I release my mouse button, that is now listed. So this Game of Thrones cup fixed layer is now the child of this cup position layer, and this cup position layer is the parent. Now if I come over here, I've done nothing to my keyframes. These track point keyframes are all still there, and they're looking pretty decent still. But it is now the child, all right? This layer is now the child of this layer, this parent layer. So with cup position control selected, that null object, I can now move the null object around. And it's going to allow me to move that layer. Okay, as I move the parent layer around, that null object, the child layer will follow. And I've never heard it being called a child layer. I'm just using it as an analogy here. But the parent layer is an actual term. And I'm just going to line this up to the best of my ability just by moving the null object there. All right, so now well, maybe I haven't. Let me, well, oh yeah, that makes sense. I'm doing it right. Okay, there you have it. So now I've lined up that layer, and you can see there, I've done that by moving the null object, the parent layer. The keyframes themselves haven't been adjusted at all. They're still doing exactly what they were doing. So I just shifted the whole thing over with the null object, and the keyframes are still doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing when I set them. So now if I play this back, look at that. That's not perfect, but man, it's close. And that didn't take more than 20 minutes, right? So it just makes you wonder, why did they keep it there? Okay, so that was a really basic track and mask maneuver there. We just erased part of the table, and then we used that still frame and tracked it to something else that was on the table throughout the motion. And now we've got a pretty decent cover up right there that no one would really notice. Once again, this goes back to your sense of composition. Now you could say that she may be the subject of the frame, but she's also out of focus. What the real subject of the frame probably is are these two guys right here. This is where the most motion is. There's obviously some dialogue going on, and they're also perfectly in focus. So I would say that most people are probably focused on them. Fewer people are going to be focused on her. And so this track and this erasure of the coffee cup, probably pretty decent as is. Probably no one would even figure out that we did that, just with that slight little adjustment. Now, if you're a perfectionist, you could go in there and continue to clean it up. I see a little bit of a problem like right here with his face or whatever this is in the foreground. As it moves over, you can kind of see the layer kind of spilling its secrets ever so slightly. But it's really not that bad. Very basic work right there. Now, let's get into something much more complicated, which is L5 echo. This is the last tracking job I'm going to make you guys do, and then we're going to move on to keying. But this one is a doozy, and this is a project that I had to do. So I will tell you that I'm going to teach you guys this from my own personal experience of having done it. So this is a television show, a little interactive television show that was made, probably 5 or 6, 8 years ago maybe. And these two people are on a date. Little does she know, he is a vampire. And so he's gonna, there's some mystery here, right? Like, is he gonna attack her or not? But anyways, this was kind of an indie film, and they had limited gear, they had limited time, shooting down there in the Garden District, and kind of getting late. They were running up against their 12-hour clock, and they needed to get this crazy Steadicam shot as they walked down the street. And the DP said, you know what, I can't light this very well without putting this light in the shot. All right, don't have enough time to fix it. And they literally said, let's fix it in post. So they brought this over here to me, and they said, you know what, we got a light in the shot. I said, okay, I can get rid of that easy. I didn't know at the time that it was a Steadicam shot and that it was at nighttime and that it was people were obstructing it in the shot and things like that. I mean, it's extremely complicated. So I started to brainstorm. I said, what could I cover this up with, right? Now, number one, I could take this into Photoshop and I could try and Photoshop this out. But if I'm watching this thing, man, there's so much stuff going on in the background and there's parallax happening that I would not be able to do it with just erasing it in one frame and then masking it like we just did with the coffee cup. I would have to erase it through multiple frames, and that would be pretty nightmarish. So the solution I came up with was to cover it up with something that I knew would be there already. And so my thought was immediately, let's put a parking meter over there. It's going to be a tall parking meter, but hey, if someone's really paying attention to it in the background, there's a lot more problems going on with this film than that little composite right there. So the first thing I'm going to do to cover this light up is I am going to drop my parking meter onto the shot, and I'm going to try and color correct it so that it looks fairly normal. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to do to start this whole process is to get my parking meter in there and color correct it and try to make it look as natural as possible. Once again, I'm just going to start on frame 0 here. Frame 0. Get your playhead all the way to the beginning, doing some tracking stuff. And look inside of your stills folder, and you're going to find that layer 1 parking meter PSD in there. And all I did here was I went to Google Images, searched for a parking meter. Gonna go ahead and need to open up those transform properties there and scale that down so you can see it a little bit better. Yep, that's just an old-fashioned parking meter from a still I stole off of Google. And no one's ever gonna know because we're gonna color correct this and make it really dark so that it looks right. But Google Images is always your friend. Always remember that, you know. You can always steal things from Google, and if you change it up enough, man, no one will ever know that you did it. So I'm going to go ahead and scale this down to something that I think looks pretty realistic for generally the scene, and it's also kind of a utilitarian issue as well, right? Like I need to make sure that it's covering that light up as much as I can. So I'm scaling it down, and I'm also at the same time just moving it over that light to make sure that it's looking okay. Got to cover up both the light stand and the light itself. Something like that. Maybe I'll drop it down a little bit as well so that it's a little lower in the frame. Alright, so now you're like, man, that looks bad. Well, yeah, it does. But we have a long way to go here. So now I'm going to go over and go with my parking meter selected. I'm going to use some color correction here. So I'm going to go to Effect, Color Correction, Lumetri Color. And I'm going to substantially drop the brightness of this image. Number of ways you could do that. I'm probably going to start with curves here and drag that down as much as I can. So I'm in the curves window. You can see what I'm doing here. I just grabbed the upper side of the curve, this upper point which represents white, and I'm just going to drag that right down the lookup table all the way down so that more or less whatever was white is now becoming really, really dark gray and everything else in between. And that gives you the effect of shadow, right? Like you can still barely make out those highlights like you would in real life. But also, it's very dark. So go ahead and find your color correction scheme there. Darken it up as much as you possibly can while making it look as realistic as possible. That's still probably just a smidgen too bright, so I'm going to drop that down some more. Now, if I were to do that instead of with my curves window, I might do that over here on my color wheels, which we talked about last time as well. So maybe I'll drag my highlights way down on my color wheel, and my midtones as well, and my shadows. You can see that did not work nearly as good, right? So I think curves might be the way to go in that general vicinity. Come down here to that curve window and make a really aggressive move with your curve. Drop that line all the way down till you get just barely a little flicker of white on the screen where the brightest areas of those parking meter, those white areas are going to be kind of showing up in that light. Now the next thing I'm going to do, is I might add a little bit of warmth to this, right? Everything around there is warm. We've got these really red, orange sodium vapor lights on the street. That's going to tint everything in the shot orange as it's doing, and my parking meter is no exception. So I'll come over here and maybe in my midtones add a little bit of warmth in there on my color wheels. So this is kind of a two-step process. I used my curve window to substantially drop the luminance in the shot for the layer 1 parking meter. And then I used my color wheels to add some warmth into the parking meter so that it looks like it's lit more or less by the same exact light that everything else is being lit with. Now we're starting to cook with gas a little bit here. It's starting to look pretty darn good. The next thing I need to do is blur it out some. And I'm just using context clues, right? As a visual effects artist, you've always got to look at the surroundings and you've got to figure out, what is going on in the image. So in this particular area, the focus of the image is on their eyes. And in general, in this surrounding area right here, you've got a pretty substantial amount of soft focus. And that's more or less where that parking meter would be sitting, is over there near these bushes and stuff like that. So I'm going to go ahead and blur this out some. In addition to my lumetri color, still got my parking meter selected. I'm going to come up here and go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fast Box Blur. Now you could do a camera lens blur in here, but once again, I mean, I wouldn't, because it's just going to take up a bunch of your performance, your computer's performance. And this is supposed to be something that's so out of focus and dark and in the background, no one's probably going to even look at it. You know, the difference between that really complicated blur and this simple fast blur is going to be really negligible. So, Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fast Box Blur. Go ahead and select that. Now I'm just going to bring up my blur radius until it's starting to look right. And that looks pretty darn good. Now I might probably need to go back and adjust some more things here. I'm worried about this pole. I am. It's been 8 years since I did the shot, so I can't remember what I did, but this pole to me seems like it's a little too bright. It's standing out quite a lot. And it's also kind of showing my secrets, because that pole should be more or less embedded over there with the bushes, and right now it's way over here kind of in the foreground element. So what I'm probably going to do is darken this up even more. Going back to my lumetri color. Under curves, I'll probably bring that down even more substantially into the shadows there. And that's going to help that out a lot. Okay, so now I've got my parking meter placed and color corrected within the background. It looks relatively good. Now if I were to play this, I mean, that looks good for one frame exactly, and then it all falls apart. You can see it just the light travels right behind it. We lose it. So now we've got to motion track that light over time. So let's go ahead and get that done as well. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my layer for right now. What's great about this is, because this was already kind of its own Photoshop layer and we didn't change its shape by masking it out. Check it out, the anchor point's already embedded in the geometric center of the layer, so that's going to save us some time. We don't have to move the anchor point over. I'll go ahead and turn off that layer though by turning that eyeball off. And now we need to track this light in the background across the entire thing. Now this is going to get tricky because the light is obscured by his face and his coat. Very tricky moment right there. And that's where some artistry is going to come in on your part. After Effects is going to give up, and you're going to have to carry that track the rest of the way. So with the video file, which is the bottom layer, selected, we're going to come back over here to our trusty track motion tool. Go ahead and click on track motion there. That will bring up my new track point. And again, just to recap, this is our target, this is our area of interest, and this is our search area. Most of these are going to have to be enlarged, both of them. So I'm going to move my target right over there to the center of that light. What's great about this is that the light is a highly contrasty, relatively small object in the frame that can be easily tracked for the most part. So that's great news. And the first thing I'm going to do with this track point selected there and set on top of my light is I'm going to go ahead and scale it up as much as I can. So that's the search area, all right? There's a lot of movement from frame to frame here. So we're going to want to make sure that the search area is more or less as big as we can get it within the confines of the frame. So that's more or less something like this. And then I'm going to change my area of interest so that it's more or less encompassing the entire light bulb there. Make sure that area of interest is centered on the light bulb itself, and that my target is more or less dead center of the light bulb. So once you've got that track point more or less established right there, the next thing you're going to do is come down here and press that Analyze Forward button. Now I want you guys to watch me do this, because what's going to happen is the moment this light goes behind him, his face and his coat, After Effects is going to totally freak out. It's going to totally lose the light, and it's just going to start splattering track points everywhere. And the keyframes are going to be all off. So I need to stop that at some point. So I'm going to go ahead and press play, and get my track going here. And you'll see when I press play that there's a little stop button right there. So I'm going to keep my mouse on the stop button. And as this is tracking forward, I'm going to be prepared for the slightest evidence of chaos, which is right about to happen as this goes behind him. After Effects is about to freak out. Oh, there it goes. And you can see that in the track. Now, number one, that was a pretty beautiful track. That worked out really well. Tracking the light because it was so bright in the frame gave After Effects plenty of material to work with in terms of figuring out its motion, and so you could see the motion of the light in the frame. And this is amazing because this is also a memory of the camera operator's movements, right? This is their footsteps. This is the movement of the camera on the Steadicam. It's pretty cool. Now, you'll see as soon as it went behind him, these are my last three keyframes right here. And you can see where things started to go awry, right? As soon as it went behind him over here, things just went haywire. And the track point just didn't know where to go. Just started freaking out. It moved to his chin. It said his chin must be the thing. I'm going to try and track his chin now. So we had to stop that early. If we had kept playing it through, who knows where the track points would be. They'd be all over the screen. So when you're tracking something, keep a good eye on it, because most of the time, I'm going to say 75% of the time, there's going to be a problem somewhere and you're going to have to stop and fix it. Okay, so now we've got these three kind of chaotic track points, these keyframes right here. They didn't work out, so we need to actually delete those keyframes. And to do that, I need to open up my layer right here. Again, I'm still in my layer viewer like I should be when I'm doing tracking stuff, but I can still open the layer in the composition and see the motion tracker information down here. So I'm just going to click on that little disclosure triangle and open up tracker 1 all the way till I get to track point 1. I'll open that up, and you'll see that for every single track point on the composition, it creates 3 individual keyframes. One for the feature center, one for the confidence, and one for the attach point. Ask me what those are, and I couldn't even tell you. I'm not sure. But those are the 3 keyframes. And if I kind of travel through here, I can see where things started to fall apart on me. So this is still relatively okay. But if I move my playhead 1 over, that's where it started to move to his chin. So these last 3, 1, 2, 3, are not good. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lasso these 3 keyframes, or these 3 sets of keyframes, I should say. And you can see when I lasso them, they highlight right here and fill themselves in. I'll lasso those 3 keyframes, sets of keyframes, and I'm just going to hit the delete button. And that gets rid of them altogether. Now we still got an issue, which is that the movement behind him is still undefined. And After Effects has told us very clearly that it can't do much more for us. Its job is done. So now we have to come up and estimate the movement of that light as it travels behind him, at least for the next 4 or 5 frames enough for us to be able to get that entire parking meter behind this guy, so that we can get rid of it. So to do that, what you're going to do is you're going to track for After Effects. So I'm going to come down here and zoom in on my timeline as much as I can, all the way down to the frame level. I've got my playhead parked right now on the last good frame, the last good track point. And I'm going to use my page up and page down keys while I'm doing this. Page up and page down on the keyboard. This is where having a full-size keyboard really comes in handy. But you might be able to do function page up, page down on a MacBook Pro. I'm not particularly certain where those buttons are. But normally they're over there next to the number pad on the far right-hand side of a full-size keyboard. So page down is going to give you one frame advancing forward. As every time I press page down, it moves the playhead one frame forward. And page up moves it one frame backwards. Very easy. So from my last effective keyframe right here, I'm going to hit the page down key. And you can see that the tracker hasn't moved at all. It doesn't know where to go any longer. And I'm no longer tracking. I'm no longer hitting the play button right here any longer either. I'm just going to manually move this track point now to where I think this is going. And I'm just using the trajectory that I already see here. So it starts out here, dips down, comes back up, and then slowly starts to kind of it looks to me like it's going down and it's shallowing out like that, kind of like a roller coaster. So I'm going to kind of replicate that myself. So I'm going to move to the next frame, the frame beyond my last good track point. And I'm just going to grab the center of my tracker, just like I was retargeting it, like I was targeting it onto something. I'm not grabbing that bullseye. I'm not grabbing the edge of the boxes here. I'm just grabbing into the center empty area. And I'm just going to move that tracker over some. And I'm just going to guesstimate. Maybe something like that. And you can see there that I try to keep these track points spaced out evenly. This is kind of a picture of its velocity, right? Every single frame is represented here. So if I space this new point out at about the same spacing as the last two, that's more or less keeping speed correct. And then I'm going to page down again. And I'm going to move the tracker again. Page down again. Move the tracker again. Page down again. Move the tracker again. Page down again. Move the tracker again. And we're just going to keep doing that one frame at a time here until we feel confident that this thing is behind us, is behind him. So I'm just going to keep moving forward several frames just to be safe. Using that page down button to advance one frame at a time. Alright, so there we have it. I've moved this tracking point. I've created just brand new tracking information here. Imaginary tracking information. Who knows what that light is really doing behind him? Doesn't matter. We've told After Effects that that is what the light is doing. It's kind of, from this point forward, it's all my imagination. So go ahead and take a few minutes and try and replicate the movement. I went ahead and I went to 1 hour and 10 frames here. You can go a little bit farther than that if you want, but I think that's probably going to be pretty safe. It's going to get that, that parking meter behind him pretty well at that point. Okay, so now that you've got your tracking points set, those new tracking points invented on the other side of his body there, I'm going to go ahead and apply this tracking information from the light to our parking meter layer. So once again, I've got position selected here. I'll click on Edit Target. And I'm going to make sure that the parking meter layer is selected. I'll press OK. And then I'll press Apply. Apply dimensions, keep it on X and Y. We can see right here, just by looking at this, it's moving across the X-axis and it's moving up and down on the Y-axis. So you got to have both of them moving here. So I'll press OK. And now it's applied that movement to our parking meter. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my parking meter back on and see where it's moved it. And you can see right there it's moved it into kind of a strange place, right? But let me watch that track. Not bad. Not bad. Not great, but not bad either. Okay. So now that I've got this nice track there of my parking meter, let me go ahead and close that up. I need to reposition this parking meter into its correct new position, covering up that light. Go on back to frame 0, and we're going to create another null, and we're going to parent this layer 1 parking meter to the null. Turn the null object into a parent layer. So I'm going to go to Layer, New, Null Object. I'll call this, right click on it, go to Rename, Parking Meter Control. And once again, to parent this layer, to my parking meter control, I'm just going to use my pick whip here. Left click on that, hold, and then drag it over and drop the pick whip right onto parking meter control. So now parking meter, the parking meter itself is the child of my parking meter control, and wherever my null object goes, the parking meter will go, as you can see right here. The keyframes from the parking meter's movement are not going to be affected. It's just simply shifting its position while maintaining its keyframes. So I'm going to by moving the null object, I'm going to move it back on top of my light here and of my light stand. Try and get it as much over the light as possible while keeping it as low in the frame as possible. And if I press play now, not bad, not bad. So there's the parking meter. It travels right with the light, pretty realistic fashion. But now we've got the final issue. The parking meter is not behind the guy like the light ended up being. So now we've got a big problem here. First thing I'm going to point out is, before we move on to tackling that situation, is that miraculously, after this light goes behind this guy, the Steadicam operator was able to keep it behind him the entire time. We never see the light again. So more or less, once it goes behind him, we don't have to worry about this work any longer. It's done. And I'm going to actually reflect that in my composition here. So once it goes behind him, and it's completely and utterly behind him, so maybe around frame, well, I'm just going to go to the end of my keyframes. So my keyframe stops at 1 hour and 10 frames. I'm just going to go there, and I'm going to set new out points for my parking meter null and the parking meter itself. And again, you can just hover your mouse over the edge of the layers here with both of them selected and drag left to set those out points. Or alternatively, you could use the old keyboard shortcut, which would be Alt closed brackets. And so now I've got my composition kind of tidied up. I know just visually by looking at it that this parking meter does not become an issue or is no longer an issue after this particular frame, after my out point. I don't have to worry about the back end of this composition. That is what it is. But I do have to worry about getting this parking meter covered up by him, making sure that it goes behind this guy. How do we do that? Well, we have to mask it, and we have to create a pretty complicated mask around the parking meter itself. So let's go ahead and look at how this would work. I'm going to go ahead and set the opacity of my parking meter layer temporarily to something like 90%. That way I can just barely make out when I zoom in where his facial features are and stuff beneath it. And that's going to help me control the edge of the mask that I draw. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to identify the moment that the problem begins. So I'm playing this through, and I can see that his coat starts to make contact with the parking meter itself right around this frame right here, which for me is 59:59:06. For you, based off of your tracking and how big you made that parking meter, might be totally different. We'll have to see. Okay, so now that I've got that frame found and selected, the moment that the problem starts, I'm going to start heavily employing my page up and page down keys here. So right there's my problem area. I'm going to go ahead and go to the frame before he starts to make contact with my parking meter back there. And I'm going to draw a mask around this parking meter. So let me go ahead and begin that. I'm going to click on my pen tool. And just going to start drawing a shape that roughly follows the shape of that parking meter. You don't have to keep it super tight, because the parking meter has its own kind of transparency from Photoshop. So you don't have to like really snug it in there yet. But I am going to go ahead and create some extra points around it, because I know that I'm going to need those extra points as I go here. So I just did something that looks like that. Nothing fancy, pretty roughed out. And now that we have that mask created, once again it comes time for us to keyframe those mask points, the mask path itself, so that it more or less matches with the contour of this guy. So I'm going to come over here to my layer 1 parking meter where I made that mask, and I'm going to open up the mask transform properties, and there we have mask path. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here to the kind of frame by frame level, because that's the type of work that we're going to have to do to get this right. And right before the problem area starts, which is right around here, I'm going to place my keyframe. So I'm just going to click right there on mask path. Now this is the frame before things start to fall apart. So I'm going to click on mask path right there and add a mask path keyframe. And so at this point, everything up into this one keyframe is going to, the mask path will stay the exact same. Now that I've placed that keyframe there, After Effects is going to start watching for changes across time. So when I go to the very next frame, I can see that his coat starts to cover up the parking meter a little bit. A little hard to see because of how dark it is. So using this toggle mask visibility tool is really important. And I can see right there that his coat starts to cut across this ever so slightly. And I'm going to go ahead and change the mask path there to reflect that change. So I can see his coat is starting to cut across. And I'm going to go ahead and deselect all of the mask points, right? So you want to click off of the mask inside. So I've got my mask selected here. All of my points are those filled in squares, those filled in little points. I want to turn those into individually editable points. Talked about this last class. So I kind of click in the center of the mask and it's going to give me those individual circles, which means I can individually edit each one. And I'm just going to start going through here and changing up the mask path for this particular frame so that it is roughly corresponding with the contours of this guy's coat. You know, check it out. See how I'm kind of like pulling it back a little bit, checking it out, seeing where it is, revealing what's underneath there so I can get a better idea of where his coat is. I think his coat's like right there. So you can see right here I need to add like a sharp point to the mask right here. So to do that, I can just click on my pen tool again and add a brand new point into that layer, into that mask. It's going to add a new layer there, or a new point there. And we'll just add a couple more just for good measure, 3 more maybe. So if you ever close off a mask and you're like, man, need to add some more points to it, it's no big deal. Just click back on the pen tool and hover your mouse where you want to add them on the mask line and start clicking. It'll add those points. So now that I've added those new points in, I can kind of come back over here, start investigating a little bit more as to where his coat is. Something like that. Okay, so there's my first adjustment. So if I toggle back and forth between those 2 mask path keyframes, you can see there to there, there to there, there to there. And now I've just got to keep going through until that entire parking meter is entirely behind him. So I'm just going to keep on motoring here, changing the mask path as I go, keyframing the mask path to better correspond to his coat and his body. And there's a lot of detail to be, you know, it's very shadowy down there. So you've got to kind of really pull back those mask edges, see where the coat is, see where his face is, and just try and line it up the very best that you can. It's not going to be perfect. That's okay. The shadows are hurting us. The shadows are also going to help us, because it's going to make it harder for the audience to see our secrets. So now this is starting to more interact with his face a little bit. So I'm going to try and contour the mask roughly to his face. Doesn't have to be perfect, because we're going to feather this out a little bit and make it much more soft as we go here. Just guesstimating this whole thing as we go. So you can see here in this particular part of the mask animation, he's more or less covered up the entire pole. And I need to move the edge of this mask totally outward. So I'm moving the outer edge of this mask really far. I'm just going to move it over to the edge of the frame line, really. It's not doing much for us. You know, there's nothing over here that's in the shot anymore. It's just that masked around that one parking meter. So I did have to move that mask, that far right mask edge over to compensate and to get out of the way of this rapidly adjusting left edge as we move forward here. Okay, so here we have it. Gone through there, and I've keyframed that mask from beginning to end. To roughly conform with the shape of his face there. And you can see once that pole gets covered up by his coat, I kind of just let that go. You don't have to worry about it anymore because the pole's gone. So I can kind of let these lower mask points just kind of do whatever they do. And the focus really becomes at the tail end of the shot, dealing with his face there, which is a little tricky at parts because there's a little bit of shine, a little bit of bloom coming off the light, and it's kind of touching his face in that area. And that's something that I struggled with when I did this shot, and it's something that you'll probably struggle with now as well. So I'm going to go ahead and feather my mask, maybe just a few pixels, so maybe like 5 pixels or something, who knows. See what looks best. And then the other thing I'm going to want to do is adjust my mask expansion to something that looks decent. So maybe I'll adjust it 10 pixels or so. And now, if I play this through, looks pretty good. I'd have to go in there and doctor up those few shots, continue to manipulate and play with the mask line once that, right in this area here, that's going to continually be a difficult area to handle. And the only real way you can fix that is going in there and manipulating these mask points a little bit more to get rid of that shine on his face. Luckily that's only like a 3 or 4 frame adjustment that you have to worry about. But more or less, it gives you an idea of how you would end up doing this. So when we watch this shot, unbeknownst to the audience, our light is completely gone, and we've got a parking meter back there. Looks a little tall, a little out of place, but hey, no one's going to notice it. No one should notice it if they're paying attention to the story. And it's a lot better looking than a light on a light stand. So continue to manipulate, adjust, tweak that mask till you find something that looks good. The other thing that I would recommend that you do when you're tweaking this, especially in this area where the light is starting to mess with his face there a little bit in this area, play with keyframing temporarily an expanded mask expansion or an additional amount of mask feather. Maybe increase that mask feathering or mask expansion just temporarily in this particular area of time, and then return it to what you think looks best for the rest of the scene, once that light passes. So play with keyframing, not just your mask path, but also your mask feather and your mask expansion as well. So that gives you a better idea. All right, that was a pretty significant amount of work right there. Not nearly as significant as you might run into in certain jobs, but more or less you're following the contours of human being with this mask, right? It's kind of like rotoscoping. It's frame by frame, cutting out someone from a shot. That's more or less what rotoscoping is. And you can see how time intensive it is. Takes a long time. Also needs a lot of cleanup afterwards. It's not necessarily a perfect art form. I will tell you that After Effects does have a mask tracker built in here, but in situations like this, this mask tracker would not work, and that's because it's so dark outside. There's almost no detail down here in the shadow areas that the mask tracker just would fall apart. In a very similar way to, if we were to try to warp stabilize this shot, there's just not enough tracking information in the shot. It's too dark for those track points to work right. So in a lot of situations you're going to find yourself, you have to manually mask things like this. So I told you guys that this was going to be the last tracking exercise that we did, but I want to do one more and just show you the versatility of tracking the motion in the frame. And for this, I want to bring in the shot that we did last week. So I hope you have your project files from last week, your L4 delivery files. What we're going to do is we're going to bring in that one shot that we did of the guy on the beach with the island in the background, and we're going to add in some handheld camera work to it as we go. So to import a composition from another project, you more or less begin that process in the same way that you would by importing some raw footage. So I'm just going to come over here to my project window and double click on an empty area, and then I'm going to find that particular project file. Now I'm not looking for the footage, I'm looking for the project itself. So I'm going to go to my desktop where I know that I kept this, and I've got my L4 delivery example that I was working on last week. So I'm just going to select that After Effects project file, just like I would a piece of footage, and I'll click on Import. And what it's going to do is it's going to import your entire L4 project, everything, and put it in a folder called the name of the project file. So there's my name, there's the name of that project file right there. And if I click on that and open it up, you'll see that all my raw footage is in there from that project, along with the scene that I was working on. So I called out a bunch of stuff from last week's project. I just left this in there. You're probably going to have a ton more raw footage and folders and everything else like that. But for right now, I want you to take that composition that we created, Colossus Scene 3B, and go ahead and move that up into your compositions folder. And you can kind of close that L4 delivery example folder out entirely and just double click right there to open up that composition. So if you guys remember from last week, we had this perfectly stationary shot and we put this island in the background with some stormy clouds just to add a lot of more visual drama to everything. But it's also a little boring in terms of camera movement. And in this particular scene, we wanted it to be very gritty and raw. And so what we could do here is add in some handheld camera work to make this even, number one, more realistic because it sells the composition a little bit better, the composite. And number two, to make it a little more gritty. So we've got a perfectly stationary camera shot in here. How do we add in handheld camera movement? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select my layers in this composition. And I need to combine all these layers into one individual layer so that all of these layers need to be more or less treated as one individual layer. So to do that, I'm going to select all of my layers right here, right click, and go to Pre-Compose. And I'm just going to call this Colossus COL 3B, whatever you want. And then go ahead and move that pre-composition into the pre's folder in your delivery file there. And so now you can see that everything's been pre-comped and all of that footage that was in there to begin with is now being treated as one individual layer. I can double click it once again and open up the pre-comp, and there's my footage that I pre-comped together. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find some footage of handheld camera work. And you can do this in many ways. I myself have a library of handheld shots that I've used for individual things. Some of them are from shoots. Sometimes if I need a handheld shot, I'll just go outside and I'll shoot some footage, some handheld footage with my iPhone. Works the exact same way. So if you look inside your RAW folder there, I gave you guys a handheld camera.mp4 file. So go ahead and double click on that. Open it up. You can see this was me down in Grand Isle. I was doing some location scouting for a film, and I took my Canon 7D out there, an old camera, and I was just kind of messing around, and I shot some handheld plates while I was out there. Now, good things about these handheld plates and what makes a good handheld plate. Well, the idea behind a plate is that we steal the shot's motion and get rid of the content of the shot. So we have to track the motion of the camera using one of those cloud trackers. So what do cloud trackers like? What do trackers like in general? They like detail in the frame, things that they can latch onto and stay latched onto for the majority of the shot. And you can see here that we've got a lot of good detail in the frame. We've got the beach down there, and then we've got a large horizon line in the background with this state park in the back. So we've got a lot of good detail right there that's going to be used for the cloud tracker, and that works out perfectly. So I'm gonna, instead of using this tilt up thing that I was doing here, I'm just gonna start my shot like over here once I end the tilt up, and that's gonna put me like maybe right here or so with my playhead in the footage viewer. And I'm gonna go ahead and put an endpoint there, just like you would in Adobe Premiere or Avid when you're opening up your raw footage and you're setting your in and out points. So that's that little button right there, the little in button right there. Park your playhead where you want the footage to begin, hit the end button, and it establishes the footage end point, and then it cuts out all of that stuff from the beginning. So now with my endpoint set, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this down from my project window, and I'm going to drop it onto the new composition button right here. And that's going to create my brand new composition with just that footage in it. You can see right there, this is not a good shot at all, but there is some cool handheld movement in there from my Canon 7D. It was also a really windy day, so I've got a lot of nice gritty camera work in there that I can use. And in this new composition, this handheld composition, I'm going to go ahead and track the motion. And to do that, I'm going back to my tracker panel. I've got my handheld camera footage selected. I'm going to click on Track Camera right here. And it's going to start tracking the camera. So this works a lot like the warp stabilizer. It's throwing out a cloud of tracking points, and those tracking points are attaching themselves to pixels in the frame, and they're trying to resolve the movement of the camera over time. So this is going to take a couple minutes here, so I'll come back to you guys once the track is done. Okay, and once you have your camera tracked, you should see those familiar little points jump up there. And if you kind of scrub through the footage, you should see those points kind of moving along with the camera. If for some reason they don't seem to be moving correctly with the camera, then you might need to pick a new piece of footage or something like that. But it looks like my points are working pretty well in terms of tracking the camera's movement here. And what we can do now that we've tracked this camera's movement, again, this is a new function. We looked at the warp stabilizer. We used track motion pretty extensively. This is the track camera button here. With this 3D camera tracker effect enabled on this shot, and with a full track, I can go right here and click on Create Camera. And that just created a 3D camera that is moving identically to the handheld material that I shot on the beach several years ago. So if I open this up, and you don't have to do this, but if I open this up in two views, and I change this left view to like left or something, let me go to right. There's my camera, and you can see right there that as the camera tilted and moved in real life, the camera tracker tracked that motion and created a virtual camera that is moving identically to the camera that was in my hands that day. You can kind of see it jiggling there. So now that I've got that 3D camera tracker, what I can do is select that layer, press Control-C to copy it, or I could go to Edit, Copy. Come back over here to my Colossus Scene 3B composition, this stationary shot with the island in it. And now I can hit Control-V to paste the camera on there. So now the camera's on there, but what you're going to notice is that there's no change in the motion. And that's because 3D cameras only work with 3D layers. 3D cameras only work with 3D layers. And right now, this Colossus layer is not set as a 3D layer. It's set as just a 2D layer. It's not being affected by the movement of the camera itself. So to change that, what I can do is come over here in my columns, and I'm going to look for this little cube column right here, this little 3D layer column. And you'll see there's a check mark right beneath that cube, and I'm going to put a check mark, a cube, in that column for my pre-composition that I created. Now you notice as soon as I do that it dramatically moved the composition over to the left side of the frame, but it's also moving. It's now suddenly exhibiting some kind of handheld behavior there. So now all I have to do, if I look at this, right, the 3D camera is what's moving. That's what's keyframed. If I open up my actual video layer with the pre-comp, there's actual no keyframes being shown there whatsoever. Nothing's been keyframed at all. It's just a 3D layer, and the camera is now filming that layer with that stored handheld motion, and that's why we're seeing that movement in the frame. The layer itself isn't moving, the camera is moving while it films in quotation marks, the layer. So I just have to move my pre-comp back into the shot, and you'll notice that introducing this handheld material into the composition kind of messes up the shot, right? Because it's showing you a lot of black on the front side of the frame and stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of find the worst point, the point where it skews off frame the most, and then I'll kind of fix it at that point on my composition, and then I will scale it upwards significantly. So I'm going to have to scale this layer maybe to 108% or something like that, and play it through again and see what my options are. So I'm going to have to move that over some. And just keep tweaking the scale and the position of the layer until it all fits correctly within the frame. So you can see the drawback to using this method is that there is a substantial reduction in resolution. I'm having to, for this particular camera move, you know, it was a rather aggressive, shaky handheld shot. For that particular camera move, I've had to adjust the resolution of this image here upwards of 120%. Now if you're shooting with a good camera and everything's nice and in focus, that's normally not that big a deal. But if you're shooting with a lower resolution camera or a lower quality camera, like maybe a digital SLR or something, that adjustment in resolution from 100% to 120%, that's essentially just blowing it up in the frame. That could create image problems when it gets projected or shown on a large screen. So normally you only use this method if you've got high quality footage at your disposal. And in this case, I had pretty decent camera and a really good file format that I was recording in, so this would not necessarily be scary for me to get up to that level. So you can see right there that I've got a stationary pre-composition where I was able to very easily lay in something in the background without worrying about tracking motion and things like that. And then I was able to take the camera movement of a real camera and apply it to the shot after the composite is complete, And so now I've just got this really much greater sense of realism, because the camera's moving and the island is moving with the movement of the camera as well. And it just kind of sews everything up together in a much nicer package. And for this particular shot, it works really great because this scene calls for this type of herky-jerky motion. Okay, so that's going to be it for our motion tracking section. The next thing that we are supposed to cover today is keying, color keying. And that is essentially green screen and blue screen work. So the first one I want to show you guys is L5F. So go ahead and double click on that to open it up. And I've got a shot of this guy here driving a car down the road. But of course, he's just driving in a green screen room. So the advantage to doing something like this is that you can, very easily light your talent. You can also have really nice, safe driving scenes where, characters are sitting in a car talking to one another and you don't have to hire a big crew and lock down a big bunch of streets and stuff like that. You just composite in the background, whatever background you want. Now, a lot of the times, they'll do something like this. They're using even newer methods these days. That includes, putting large, huge screens behind the television or behind the car windows that look like, driving. It's footage of a camera being driven down the street, right? And so they'll put that on a huge screen behind the car, and when you look through the window, you're just seeing some footage of cars and buildings and people going by, just like you would in real life. So it's kind of like going back to the days of rear projection and things like that. We're kind of going back into a big circle, but using digital technology, so it looks very, very real. But this is another alternative. Green screen someone in the car and be able to light them, create a much more dynamic and easy to shoot shot, and save a lot of money in production doing it. The question is, how do we get rid of this green screen? Well, that's where color keying comes in. And I'm going to tell you right now that there is a number of keying filters, plugins in After Effects, but there's only one really good free one that's going to be included in your After Effects copy. You can buy different ones from third-party vendors, but they normally get pretty expensive. So I'm going to show you the one that works really well, that comes free with all versions of After Effects. So the first thing I want to show you guys is the importance of denoising a shot before you key it out. Now in this particular shot right here, I've got some substantial noise from the camera. If I zoom in really close and looking at this green material here, let's just pause on this green material. Might not show up in the video that I'm showing you, but if you look really closely right there, there's a bunch of green, nasty garbage back there that is essentially compression artifacts from the camera that they used to shoot this scene. So that's more or less a low quality camera, and you get these really blocky artifacts in there. There's some right there, you can see them, called block boundary artifacts. And that mosaic pattern is really tough to get around when you do a key. So what I like to do is I like to denoise my green screen footage before I actually commit to a key. And I use very special proprietary software for that does not come with After Effects. It's called Neat Video. Highly recommend that you take a look at that. Neat Video is $100. It's a product. It's made in Germany. Works for Premiere, Avid, Adobe After Effects, and DaVinci Resolve, a number of other applications. And it essentially takes those block boundary artifacts or noise generated by having the gain on in your camera or having too high an ISO. It scrubs out that noise damn near perfectly, to the point where you would never know that the noise was there to begin with, and you would never know that you had to run it through a post-production filter and get rid of it. So that is what I did here in this composition. And I'm going to show you guys later, after we get done with our key, what a challenge it would be to work with the original footage. But for right now, I want you guys to look at your composition and go ahead and turn off this top layer, GS Raw FG. Go ahead and turn that off. Click on that eyeball there. And that's going to give us an opportunity to see the background layer, which is just, once again, someone's driving down the road, camera operator sitting in the back seat, and they're sticking the camera out the window and getting some just buildings and stuff driving by in the background. So that's turned on, and I want you guys to now turn on this GS Raw FG denoised layer as well. So this one right here, go ahead and click on that little eyeball right there to turn that on, and this layer has been denoised completely. I denoised it with my special software, and you can see when I zoom in, those block boundary artifacts are totally gone. You've got a really smooth green screen back here, and that is what you want when you do green screen footage. So to pull a key, the best software to use in After Effects is called Keylight. So go ahead and make sure this middle layer is selected, GS Raw FG denoised. Make sure that's selected. Make sure that top layer is off. And go ahead and go to Effect, Keying, Keylight. Keylight is a third-party software. It's made by a company called The Foundry, which is a visual effects software company. And this is a superior keyer. Now, if I go back to that keying menu, I just want to point out that there's a number of other ones in here that you could choose. Most of these are pretty old and outdated, and they just don't work nearly as good as this one. So on occasion, you may need to use these for very particular applications, but it's been pretty rare for me. I normally just go straight to Keylight. So with Keylight active on that particular layer, the thing that you have to do to get this whole ball rolling is to adjust your screen color. Right now the screen color is set to black, and I need to make sure that that screen color is set instead to the color of the screen that I want to remove from the shot. So I'm going to click on the color picker right here, and I'm going to select the most representative green that I can from the green screen area. So when I'm looking at this window here that has the screen shining through it, there's a number of different shades of green I could choose from, but I need to select the most representative one. So this one has some skin tone in it. It's kind of a warmish green. You've got kind of a whitish green right here from his shirt. And then you've also got something over here, some kind of reflection in the window, probably from his chest and stuff like that. So we're probably going to want to stray away from that, and we're going to try and pull just a color from the purest, from the screen itself, not from any reflections or anything. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and choose something that's maybe over here in this kind of upper right quadrant of the window. And I'll just click, single left click with my eyedropper selected there. And you can see immediately it gives you a pretty fantastic result. So go ahead and RAM preview that. So what it did was, it took everything that was green in the shot, or that particular color of green, got rid of it, made that transparent. Everything that was not green remained opaque. That's the entire idea behind keying. And so we've cut a hole in the layer here using this Keylight effect, and the layer beneath it, this street background, is showing through where the green screen once was. So just to show you guys what this would look like if I tried to pull this key on the noisy shot before I denoised it, I'm just going to go ahead and do that for you right now. You do not have to do this. But I've got my original shot selected here before the denoise. I'll apply my Keylight filter to it, and I'll try and pull that key, and look at all this garbage back there. You see all that? That is from the noise of that camera. That's the low quality footage shining through there. That's why it's always best to shoot visual effects and your movies in general these days on the best camera you can get. And if I play this forward, look at that sparkle and that crazy, those compression artifacts and stuff just kind of shining through. So had I not denoised the footage, this is the result I would be getting, and I would be hard pressed to make that look good. But I ran it through the denoiser and I get a really nice clean key now that's very photorealistic, and no details really been lost. Pretty much everything that was in the noisy shot is there. It's just that there's no noise anymore. So this key looks really good right off the bat, and this is another example of things going a little eerily too well when you do something for class. Which is to say that normally, most of the time, keys don't go as smoothly as they're going right now. And that's because of all sorts of different things that are happening. You know, the lighting could be uneven on the screen, the green screen itself, maybe casting reflections into the car. All sorts of different problems could occur when you're keying stuff out. And that's why this key light isn't just kind of a turnkey operation where you select the screen color. There's a number of other controls in here that we can look at that help manipulate and control the key. And that's what I want to show you guys right now. So with this selected here, if I wanted to say, you know, if I was like, man, I don't like the reflection of his arm in the window, which, to be honest with you, I mean, it might not look like that at nighttime, right? There's a lot of light pouring through the window of this car right now, and it might simply not look that clear in real life. So what I can do here is I can adjust my keying parameters to try and get rid of that arm potentially. And I do that by adjusting what's called the screen mat. So when you open up the screen mat controls down here in the key light controls, you've got a number of different values here, but you also have to change the way that you're viewing this to help control the image. So if you come up here to view, right now I'm viewing the final result. That's the end state product, the end product of the key. If I click on final result and I change it from that to, let's say, screen mat, it's going to show me what's called the mat. And again, a mat is more or less like a mask, except instead of lines dictating, you know, what's transparent and what's opaque in the shot, it's colors. All right, it's brightness. So in this case, black is transparent, white is opaque, and anything that's gray is kind of semi-transparent and semi-opaque. So that's where these screen mat controls come in. So if I wanted to make the window darker, and I wanted to clip off some of these middle gray values that are kind of there and kind of not, I can come here to clip black and kind of roll that value forward. And it's going to start clipping off anything that was kind of falling in that medium gray area. So I can be really aggressive with it and make that window just perfectly clean just by using the clip black value there. And now if I go back to my final result in the view drop-down menu, that's what I end up getting. So now the window is almost perfectly clean. Getting a little bit of his reflection here. I'd still want to clip off a little bit. But it got rid of his arm in the shot. It got rid of the dirt and everything that was going on in the back window here. And it made that a lot cleaner looking. Now the next thing I can do, and I'm seeing this problem right now, is like when this light passes over his head, you can kind of see it shining through the car. So I'm going to go to view again and change that back to screen mat. And it's shining through the car because this car area is not perfectly white. I'm actually seeing some of that sign shine through it because it's kind of transparent right here as opposed to perfectly opaque. So to change that and clip that off, what I would do is change my clip white value. And I would drag that downwards to make that area perfectly white. And so now I've got areas of perfect opaqueness, and I've got areas of perfect black, perfect transparency. And now if I view my final result, I get something that looks like this. Now in my mind, that doesn't look very realistic. The edges are extremely hard. Let's look, if I zoom in and I do 100%, look how hard the edge is on his face right there and on his nose. You've almost got like a black line that's kind of haloing him right where that matte line is. Looks okay back here, but in my mind this just does not look nearly as realistic. But so I'm going to set those values back, but it's just something to keep in mind. A lot of the times you're going to need to use that clip black and clip white to help adjust a key, to bring out things and cut out things that maybe you don't necessarily want in the shot. Let's go back to my screen mat, show you guys a couple more controls here. In addition to clip black and clip white, something that you might want to look at is this screen softness. And this works just like the feather control on your mask. So if I adjust my screen softness upwards, it's going to start blurring the edge where transparency and opaqueness meet. So I can drag that upwards and create a really nice feathered edge there. And then shrink and grow works a lot like mask expansion. So if I drag that grow outwards, it's going to grow the mat out. And if I drag it the other way, it's going to shrink the mat. So these are all parameters that I encourage you to play with and experiment with. Those are the most important three that I would tell you though. Let me just show you what the softness would look like if we had the softness up. You can see right there that it's really not doing it for me right here. Once again though, you may find yourself in a position where you have to adjust those parameters to make it that soft so that it looks right. Every single key for every single shot is going to be its own puzzle. And the puzzle pieces themselves are your choices right up here, you know, in terms of the screen color and the screen matte options. And you have to find the right configuration to get the best looking shot. So another common problem that you're going to run into when you're keying is hair, particularly long hair. So if I have this shot of this woman here, and she's moving her hair around on purpose here for this particular test, you can see that the motion blur created by her hair moving in the shot here has created a very soft line naturally between the screen and her hair. And you've got these areas of hair where it's blending into the screen and you're kind of getting a little bit of hair but a lot of bit of screen and stuff like that. That is a nightmare for color keying. Okay, so we have tools that can help us with this, but it's never going to be perfect. The tool I wanted to show you guys today is within Key Light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this top layer here, which is the layer, which is her layer, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to go to Effect, Keying, Key Light, and I'm going to choose my screen color. And once again, I'm looking for something that's representative, also looking for something that's relatively close to your talent. Okay, so I don't want to pick something that's way over here. That doesn't really necessarily matter. I'm trying to pull transparency around this person. So I'm going to maybe try and find something right there. And there we have it. Now, looks good, looks okay right there. But we've got a little bit of discoloration here in her hair. And that's because the blue screen is still kind of showing through a little bit right there. And that is not a good thing. So when she flips it though, it gets even worse. Let's look at that. As she moves her hair, the motion blur is starting to confuse the keyer. And so we've got this purple hair right here which is not good, right? I mean, no one wants to see that. Once I saw this a few years ago on one of Britney Spears' last videos. She was like dancing around in front of a green screen, and her hair was kind of moving back and forth in the shot, and you could see these really hard, nasty discolorations and these harder matte lines there where the hair is starting to blend in with the green screen or the blue screen, and it's starting to look pretty gross. So sometimes this is fixable, sometimes it's not. Let's try it and fix this though. So with that blue screen pulled, the next thing I want you guys to look at is this edge color correction section right here. Edge color correction. And the entire purpose of this is to try and color correct the edge of the mat, that space between the screen and the subject of the frame, which right now is constituted by this crazy hair problem that we're having. So with edge color correction turned on, I'm going to go ahead and put a check mark right there. I'm going to go down in this section to edge color balancing. Edge color balancing right there. So again, I'm in edge color correction. Open that up. And then in there is another section, and it's called color balancing. So I'm going to click on that. And there you have a color wheel, not unlike the Lumetri color wheel that you're so used to. So if I drag this puck around, I can change the color of that edge hair. So I'm going to try and find something that looks natural as I possibly can get it. A little bit too much green in there, but man, that was pretty good. So go ahead and play around with this edge color correction wheel and see if you can find something that looks pretty decent. So I've kind of found something that is comparable to the color of her actual hair. You can see I've got a lot of purple hair in here still. That's no problem. What we need to do once again is adjust the edge matte. And to do that, in the edge color correction section, I'm going to change this edge softness, and I'm actually going to increase the value there. And that's going to start softening that edge line. You can see it's starting to blend in that hair there. And just like with the key itself, you've got to play around with these settings. A lot of these are should be familiar to you. Edge softness is more or less feathering, and edge grow is more or less like matte shrink or grow. So there you go. I played around with these settings just a little bit. I changed my edge softness, so I was much more aggressive with that. And then I also grew my edge a little bit. And now I've got a much more natural result. And if I continue tweaking that, I could probably, fix just you still having a little bit of purple hair right there. I could probably continue to tweak these numbers and try and find a solution there. So go ahead and take a few minutes and continue to tweak using those additional tools. See if you can find a good solution. And the last one we're going to do today, and I'm going to kind of leave you guys on it, and hopefully you guys will take the time to continue to work on it by yourselves, is this particular shot right here. L5H, our last composition for the day. You can see here it's two guys fighting on a green screen, doing some karate moves or something. I don't know what it's called. Then underneath it, we've got a dojo here. And in this footage, first we need to pull a key. So go ahead and pull a key with that. Select the footage, go to Effect, Key, Key Light. Pull your key. And then once you've got the key pulled, number of things that you're going to have to do. First, you're going to have to adjust the matte of the key. So I'm going to adjust my screen matte here. So go to the view, go to screen matte. You can see that for the most part, it did a pretty good job at keeping these guys opaque, but we do have some of the floor and stuff is a little on there. Up to you as to whether you think you should keep that. Personally, I don't mind it, so I'm going to kind of keep it. I am a little worried about his foot. They do seem a little transparent, so I'm going to go back to my screen matte, and I'm going to adjust my screen matte settings here and clip the white even more so that they're less transparent. Yeah, that fixed it. Ooh, foot's still a little transparent there. Got to go back to my screen matte. Here we go. Something like that, maybe. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to adjust the scale of this layer. Okay, so I'm going to go down here to my transform properties, and I want you guys to scale it to something that you think looks fairly realistic for the scale of the scene. You can also adjust their placement, so maybe they're over here, or they're over here. And the last thing, and the thing that I'm going to leave you guys with, is check out those tracking points up there. So if you look right here on the green screen, raw footage, you can see those little triangles, and those are actually tracking points specifically for the trackers that we've been using in After Effects already today. Now this isn't a moving shot by any means, but if this was a dolly shot or something, you know, the cloud tracker is going to want some kind of points to hold on to, and that's what these little triangles are doing. They're giving After Effects, or whatever visual effects and compositing software you're using, it's giving that software some hard, easily trackable points so that you can track the motion of the camera and of anything else that's moving in the frame. That's what those are for. Now, unfortunately, throwing those up there creates a problem, which is that you've got, they didn't key out at all, did they? They're just right up there in the shot with us still. So what you need to do once you do a key is you need to do what's called a garbage matte. And a garbage matte is essentially a matte that tells you in a key what is garbage and what is not. So we're going to draw a mask around the thing we want to keep, and anything outside of that mask will be treated as garbage. Normally I only hear garbage matte being used anymore when it's specifically in terms of cleaning up a key. So let me go ahead and select this layer here. Got my key pulled. I just want to get rid of these things. And look, check this out. Look at there. That's like the edge of the frame line there. It had a little black in it. So we got to get rid of that too. Simple enough though, because what we can do is draw our matte around the thing we want to keep, which is these guys. Just like so. Now the problem, they're moving. And so you're going to have to keyframe your mask over time so that it compensates for the movement of his foot as he kicks it through the air and the movement of this guy as he ducks down. That's where I'm going to leave you guys. Take some time, practice this manual keyframing of the mask path a little bit more, and try and animate around your garbage mask so that it maintains everything that the motion of the characters inside of it, so that it keeps these guys inside and doesn't cut them off or anything like that. Good luck.